Dearest listeners, if you find yourself captivated by tales of high society and whispered secrets, consider giving us a like and subscribing to our chronicle. There exists no creature more fascinating than a widow who must navigate the treacherous waters of second chances whilst the Tun watches her every breath. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a duchess torn between duty and desire, between a prince's golden crown and a duke's faithful heart. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Earl Grey, must be savored properly. The season of 1816 had begun with unusual promise for those who dwelt within the gilded circles of London society. The war with Napoleon had finally ended. Trade flourished once more, and the Prince Regent's court sparkled with renewed vigor. Yet for her Grace, Arabella Montclair, Duchess of Ashworth, the season brought only the familiar weight of solitary responsibility that had pressed upon her shoulders for 2 long years. At 24, Arabella possessed the kind of beauty that poets claimed could launch ships, though she had grown weary of such comparisons. Her auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, and her emerald eyes, rarely given to displays of weakness, could harden with the cold determination of a seasoned negotiator, or soften with the melancholy of solitary remembrance. She had learned to carry herself with the regal bearing expected of her station, though those who knew her well might detect the slight tension in her shoulders that spoke of burdens carried alone. The Duchess had awakened that April morning in her Mayfair mansion to the familiar ritual of correspondence that governed her days. Her secretary, Mr. Finch, had arranged the morning's letters with his customary precision upon her escritoire. Bills from tradesmen, invitations to various entertainments, and the ever-present communications from her solicitors regarding the complex financial affairs of the Ashworth estates. One must confess that widowhood, whilst affording certain freedoms unavailable to married ladies, brought with it responsibilities that would have challenged many a gentleman. Arabella had discovered in those first months following her husband's death in that tragic duel that the Duke had left his affairs in considerably more disorder than anyone had suspected. The late Duke of Ashworth, for all his charm and social grace, had possessed an unfortunate tendency toward gaming and speculation that had left his estate encumbered with debts of alarming proportion. Each morning brought its familiar burden of careful calculation. Each expenditure must be weighed, each investment scrutinized, each decision considered not merely for its immediate consequences, but for its effect upon the hundreds of souls who depended upon the Ashworth lands for their livelihoods. The responsibility sat heavy upon her, though she bore it with the dignity expected of her breeding. Her lady's maid, the faithful Higgins, had entered with the morning chocolate and the day's selection of correspondence that required more immediate attention. Among these lay an invitation that caused Arabella's breath to catch momentarily in her throat. The Danish embassy requested the honor of her presence at a soirée the following evening, an event to welcome His Royal Highness Prince Henrik of Denmark to London society. The prince had arrived in London some weeks prior, ostensibly to strengthen diplomatic ties between the two nations, though the drawing rooms buzzed with speculation regarding his true purpose. At 28, Prince Henrik remained unmarried, a circumstance that had not escaped the notice of ambitious mammas throughout the Tun. He was reported to be a gentleman of considerable charm and intellect, possessed of that particular continental sophistication that English society found so fascinating. Arabella studied the invitation with the careful attention she had learned to pay to all matters that might affect her position. As the widow of one of England's premier dukes, her acceptance or decline of such invitations carried weight beyond mere social courtesy. The Danish prince's court would expect the attendance of ladies of the highest rank, and her absence might be noted and misconstrued. Yet she found herself hesitating, her fingers drumming softly against the polished surface of her desk. The invitation represented more than a simple evening's entertainment. She had observed, with the sharp awareness that widowhood had taught her, the way certain gentlemen had begun to regard her with increasing interest as her period of mourning had drawn to its close. A widow of her youth and position, particularly one who controlled substantial properties, represented an opportunity that many would find irresistible. The morning progressed with its usual round of duties. Arabella received her housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, to discuss the management of the household, reviewed the weekly accounts with her steward and spent an hour in correspondence with the various agents who managed her husband's far-flung properties. Each task required decisions, each decision carried consequences, and each consequence reflected upon not merely her own welfare, but upon the welfare of all who depended upon the Ashworth name. It was during these morning hours that her butler, the impeccable Jameson, announced a visitor whose presence both pleased and troubled her in equal measure. Edmund Thornfield, Duke of Ravenswood, had called to pay his respects, as had become his custom since her period of formal mourning had ended. Edmund had been her late husband's closest friend since their days at Eton, and his loyalty to the Ashworth family had never wavered, even through the dark months following the duel that had claimed Robert's life. At 32, Edmund possessed the kind of quiet strength that inspired confidence without demanding attention. His dark hair had begun to show the first threads of silver at the temples, and his gray eyes held a steadiness that spoke of a character tested by adversity and found sound. The Duke of Ravenswood had never married, a circumstance that had puzzled society for years. He possessed everything that should have made him the most sought-after bachelor of his generation. A fortune that rivaled any in England, properties that stretched across 3 counties, and a reputation for honor that was beyond question. Yet he had remained steadfastly single, declining the most advantageous matches with a polite firmness that had eventually discouraged even the most persistent matchmaking mamas. Arabella received him in the morning room, where the spring sunlight streaming through the tall windows lent warmth to the pale blue silk that covered the walls. Edmund entered with the easy grace that marked all his movements, his presence bringing with it that peculiar sense of security she had come to associate with his visits. She had learned to treasure these calls, though she would not have admitted such a thing even to herself. In a world where every conversation carried the weight of social consequence, where every gesture was observed and interpreted, Edmund's visits offered a respite from the constant performance that her position demanded. With him, she could speak frankly of her concerns regarding the estate, could seek advice without fear of appearing weak, could simply be Arabella rather than the Duchess of Ashworth. Yet lately, she had begun to notice something in his manner that both thrilled and alarmed her. There was a warmth in his gray eyes when they rested upon her, a particular attention to her comfort and welfare that went beyond mere friendship. She found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that seemed dangerous, found her thoughts returning to their conversations at odd moments throughout her days. Such feelings, she knew, could lead only to complications that her precarious position could ill afford. Edmund was Robert's friend first and always, and she was Robert's widow, bound by both memory and propriety to maintain the dignity of her late husband's name. The Tun watched her every move with the sharp eyes of those who lived for gossip, and any hint of impropriety could destroy not merely her own reputation, but the careful stability she had worked so hard to maintain for the Ashworth estates. The conversation that morning had touched upon the usual subjects: the progress of spring planting on both their estates, the latest news from Parliament, the success of various agricultural improvements they had discussed in previous meetings. Yet beneath these safe topics, Arabella sensed an undercurrent of tension that had not been present in their earlier friendship. Edmund had mentioned, with what she recognized as studied casualness, the invitation she must surely have received to the Danish embassy's soirée. His gray eyes had watched her face with an attention that made her pulse quicken despite her efforts to maintain her composure. She had confirmed her intention to attend, noting with what she told herself was mere curiosity, the way his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly at her words. As Providence would have it, their conversation had been interrupted by the arrival of another caller, one whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere of the room. Lady Margaret Thornton, Arabella's sister-in-law and one of society's most accomplished gossips, had swept into the morning room with the air of one bearing news of considerable import. Margaret had wasted little time in sharing the intelligence that had brought her calling at such an early hour. The Prince of Denmark, it seemed, had been making particular inquiries regarding the eligible ladies of London society, and Her Grace the Duchess of Ashworth had featured prominently in these discussions. The diplomatic community buzzed with speculation that His Royal Highness might be seeking more than mere diplomatic ties with England. The implications of such speculation were not lost upon any of the room's occupants. A match between the Danish prince and an English duchess would represent an alliance of considerable political and social significance. For Arabella personally, such a match would solve her financial difficulties at a stroke, whilst elevating her to a position of international prominence that few English ladies could hope to achieve. Edmund had taken his leave shortly after Margaret's arrival, though not before Arabella had caught a glimpse of something that might have been pain in his steady gray eyes. She told herself that she imagined such things, that her own confused feelings were causing her to read meanings into expressions that held none. Yet the memory of that look lingered with her throughout the remainder of the day, troubling her thoughts in ways she could not easily dismiss. The evening had brought no peace to her restless mind. As she sat in her private sitting room, reviewing correspondence by lamplight, Arabella found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the invitation that lay upon her desk. The Danish embassy's soirée represented more than a social engagement. It represented a crossroads at which she must choose the direction of her future. She understood, with the clarity that comes from years of navigating the complexities of high society, that her attendance at such an event would be interpreted as encouragement to the prince's rumored interest. To accept would be to step onto a path that might lead to a crown. To decline would be to close a door that might never open again. Yet she found herself curiously reluctant to embrace an opportunity that logic insisted was beyond her wildest dreams. Such was the way of hearts in those days, forever at war with the demands of duty and the requirements of position. As Arabella finally retired to her chambers that night, she found herself standing before her escritoire, the Danish embassy's invitation gleaming like fate itself beneath the lamplight. Her fingers traced the edge of the ivory paper, then reached for her pen. The nib hovered above the acceptance card, trembling with the weight of kingdoms and hearts alike. In that suspended moment, with London sleeping beyond her windows, the Duchess of Ashworth stood poised between two worlds, one of duty that promised everything, and another, unnamed and uncertain, that whispered of something her heart dared not yet acknowledge. The pen remained poised above the paper, and in her silence, the Duchess found herself wondering, was she about to sign the contract for her marriage, or the sentence upon her own heart? The evening of the Danish embassy's soirée arrived with all the pageantry that London society could muster when entertaining foreign royalty. Arabella had chosen her attire with the careful consideration such an occasion demanded. A gown of deep sapphire silk that complemented her coloring whilst maintaining the dignity appropriate to her rank. The Ashworth sapphires, worn for the first time since her husband's death, graced her throat and ears with their ancient luster. The Danish embassy had been transformed for the occasion into a glittering showcase of diplomatic hospitality. Flowers from the finest London houses filled every available surface, whilst crystal chandeliers cast their warm light over assembled guests who represented the pinnacle of English society. The air hummed with conversation in multiple languages as diplomats, nobles, and distinguished visitors mingled in carefully orchestrated harmony. Arabella arrived at the fashionable hour, neither early enough to appear eager nor late enough to seem discourteous. Her entrance caused the subtle stir that always accompanied the appearance of a duchess, though she had learned to ignore such attention with the practiced grace of one born to high station. She moved through the receiving line with the measured dignity expected of her position, exchanging pleasantries with the Danish ambassador and his lady, whilst her eyes discreetly surveyed the assembled company. It was whispered throughout the drawing rooms that Prince Henrik possessed the kind of magnetism that drew attention without apparent effort, and Arabella found this reputation to be well-founded when she was presented to His Royal Highness. The prince stood perhaps 2 inches above 6 feet, his fair hair catching the candlelight as he bent over her gloved hand with the fluid grace of one trained from birth in the art of courtesy. His blue eyes held an intelligence that spoke of education and experience far beyond his years, whilst his smile conveyed just the right degree of warmth without overstepping the bounds of propriety. The prince's manner toward her carried that particular attention which a gentleman might show to a lady who had caught his interest, though he was far too accomplished to allow such interest to appear obvious to the casual observer. Their initial conversation followed the prescribed patterns of diplomatic courtesy. Her thoughts on the embassy's Venetian chandeliers, "Exquisite, Your Highness, though perhaps not quite so fine as those at Carlton House." Her impressions of the musical entertainment. "The soprano possesses remarkable range, do you not agree?" Her observations regarding London's unseasonably pleasant April weather. "Indeed, Your Highness, one might almost believe spring had arrived to honor your visit." Each exchange was perfectly polite, utterly proper, and hollow as crystal struck too lightly to ring true. Yet beneath these conventional exchanges, Arabella detected something more calculating in the prince's manner. She recognized the subtle questions designed to elicit information about her circumstances, her interests, her position within English society. It was expertly done, so smoothly woven into their conversation that a less experienced lady might not have noticed the interrogation at all. But Arabella had learned, through hard experience, to listen for the meanings beneath words, and she understood that she was being evaluated with the same careful attention a collector might give to a potential acquisition. The recognition of this assessment stirred conflicting emotions within her breast. On one hand, she found herself flattered by the attention of a man who could have chosen any lady in Europe for his bride. The prince was undeniably handsome, possessed of that worldly sophistication that comes from travel and education, and his conversation revealed both wit and intelligence that made him a stimulating companion. Yet there was something in his manner that left her feeling oddly unsettled, as though she were being measured against some invisible standard rather than being appreciated for herself. She found herself comparing his polished charm to the quiet sincerity she had grown accustomed to in her conversations with Edmund, and the comparison left her feeling strangely hollow. The evening progressed with the elaborate dance of social intercourse that governed such gatherings. Arabella found herself claimed for the opening quadrille by the prince himself, an honor that sent ripples of speculation through the assembled company, including the sharp-eyed Lord Hartwell, whose reputation for collecting and redistributing society's secrets had earned him both fear and reluctant tolerance among the ton. They moved through the figures with the practiced grace expected of their stations, though Arabella could not ignore the weight of observation that followed their every step. Prince Henrik proved to be an accomplished dancer, guiding her through the intricate patterns with an expertise that spoke of years of court training. His conversation during the brief moments when the dance allowed for speech was both entertaining and flattering, touching upon subjects calculated to display his education whilst drawing out her own opinions with skillful questioning. Yet something in his manner suggested depth she had not suspected. His eyes would occasionally drift past her shoulder, and she caught glimpses of a melancholy that seemed to speak of someone far distant, perhaps in another court and with another lady, whose name remained as unknown to Arabella as the source of his occasional, wistful distraction. Yet as they moved through the elaborate choreography, Arabella found her attention wandering to the edges of the ballroom, where she had glimpsed a familiar figure among the diplomatic guests. Edmund stood in conversation with several gentlemen she recognized as members of Parliament, his dark evening dress lending him an austere dignity that contrasted sharply with the more elaborate court dress favored by many of the foreign visitors. She observed, with the heightened awareness that comes from strong emotion, the way his gray eyes occasionally sought her among the dancers, the slight tension in his jaw when his gaze fell upon her partner, the careful control he maintained over his expression even as she watched him watch her. The knowledge that he was present, that he was witnessing her dance with the prince, sent an unexpected flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of the quadrille. When the dance concluded, Prince Henrik escorted her to the edge of the floor with the ceremony due her rank, his manner suggesting that their partnership had been as pleasurable for him as he hoped it had been for her. He spoke of his intention to call upon her during the coming week, should such attention be welcome, and Arabella found herself accepting his request with words that committed her to nothing whilst encouraging his continued interest. It was as the prince led her toward the refreshment table that fate arranged the encounter which would alter the entire complexion of the evening. Edmund approached with the measured pace of one who had been waiting for the appropriate moment to present himself, his bow to the prince, carrying just the right degree of respect without subservience. The introduction was managed with all the diplomatic skill that such a meeting required, though Arabella noted the subtle way both men assessed each other during the exchange of courtesies. Prince Henrik's manner remained perfectly cordial, Yet she detected a sharpening of attention when Edmund was identified as the Duke of Ravenswood, one of England's premier nobles and a close friend of the late Duke of Ashworth. Edmund's behavior maintained his characteristic steady composure, though Arabella observed the slight tightening around his eyes that she had learned to recognize as a sign of inner tension. When the prince excused himself to attend to other guests, pleading the demands of diplomatic courtesy, she found herself alone with Edmund for the first time that evening. The conversation that followed would remain etched in her memory with crystalline clarity for years to come. Edmund spoke with unusual directness about the prince's obvious interest in her, his words chosen with the care of one who understood the delicacy of the subject whilst feeling compelled to address it nonetheless. He made no attempt to conceal his concern for her welfare, though he was too much the gentleman to openly question the prince's intentions. As fortune would have it, their private conversation was brief, interrupted by the approach of other guests who sought the honor of speaking with the Duchess. Yet, in those few moments, Arabella had caught a glimpse of something in Edmund's manner that made her pulse quicken, despite her efforts to maintain her composure. There had been something in his voice when he spoke of her welfare, something in the way his eyes lingered on her face, that suggested emotions held carefully in check. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of social obligations and careful conversation. Arabella moved through the required interactions with the practiced ease of one trained from birth for such events. Yet her thoughts remained divided between the prince's obvious attentions and the memory of that brief, intense conversation with Edmund. Prince Henrik claimed her for a second dance, a waltz that allowed for more intimate conversation whilst maintaining perfect propriety under the watchful eyes of the assembled company. He spoke of his impressions of London society, his appreciation for English culture, and his hopes that his visit might strengthen the bonds between their two nations. Yet beneath these diplomatic pleasantries, Arabella sensed a more personal agenda, a careful laying of groundwork for conversations that might follow in more private settings. The prince's manner throughout the waltz was perfectly calculated to please without overwhelming. He maintained just the right distance to observe propriety whilst allowing for the subtle intimacy that the dance afforded. His conversation revealed education, wit, and that particular worldly sophistication that marked him as a man of international experience. Yet despite these attractions, Arabella found herself oddly unmoved by his charm. When she caught glimpses of Edmund during the evening's remaining entertainments, she noted the careful attention he paid to avoiding any appearance of watching her too closely, though she sensed his awareness of her whereabouts throughout the gathering. The knowledge of his presence added a strange tension to her interactions with other guests, as though she were performing for an audience of one rather than the assembled company. The evening concluded with the elaborate ceremonies of leave-taking that such occasions demanded. Prince Henrik requested the honor of calling upon her later in the week, a request that Arabella accepted with the gracious acknowledgement expected of her position. Yet as her carriage carried her through the lamp-lit streets toward her Mayfair residence, where the occasional gas flame flickered amidst the more common glow of oil lamps, she found her thoughts turning not to the prince's accomplished attentions, but to the brief, charged moments she had shared with Edmund. Such was the perversity of the human heart that the evening which should have filled her with anticipation for a future beyond her wildest dreams instead left her feeling strangely hollow, as though something essential had been missing from what should have been a triumph of social success. The week following the Danish embassy soiree brought with it a flurry of social activity that seemed designed to test Arabella's ability to maintain her equilibrium in the face of rapidly shifting circumstances. Prince Henrik proved true to his word, calling upon her with the punctuality that marked all his actions, whilst the ton buzzed with speculation regarding the significance of his marked attention to the widowed Duchess. One must confess that the prince's courtship, for such it clearly was despite the diplomatic discretion with which it was conducted, proceeded with all the calculated precision of a military campaign. His visits to Grosvenor Square occurred at intervals designed to maintain interest without appearing overly eager, each call bringing with it some token of his regard: rare books from the Danish court library, hothouse flowers of exotic varieties, invitations to private concerts featuring musicians of international renown. Arabella received these attentions with the gracious acknowledgement that her breeding demanded, Yet she found herself increasingly conscious of the weight of expectation that accompanied each gesture. The prince's manner toward her carried an assumption of eventual success that, whilst never stated openly, colored every interaction with its unstated presence. She began to feel rather like a fortress under siege by a particularly courteous and well-supplied army. The astute observer would note that Edmund's visits during this period became less frequent, though when he did call, his manner carried a careful formality that had not been present in their earlier friendship. He spoke of estate matters with his customary expertise, offered advice regarding investments with his usual sound judgment. Yet beneath these safe subjects lay an undercurrent of tension that made every conversation feel fraught with unspoken significance. It was during one such visit, perhaps 10 days after the embassy soirée, that the careful balance Arabella had maintained threatened to collapse entirely. Edmund had called to discuss a matter of mutual interest regarding agricultural improvements, a subject that had provided safe ground for their interactions throughout the years of her widowhood. Yet on this particular morning, their conversation had wandered into more personal territory, with a naturalness that caught them both unprepared. They sat in the morning room, where she habitually received callers, the spring sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the square's carefully maintained gardens. Edmund occupied the chair across from her desk, where he had sat countless times before. Yet today she found herself acutely aware of his presence in ways that seemed both familiar and dangerously new. The conversation had begun safely enough, touching upon the success of certain crop rotations they had discussed in previous meetings, the progress of improvements to tenant cottages on both their properties, the prospects for the coming harvest season. Yet gradually, imperceptibly, their discussion had shifted toward more intimate territory, touching upon memories of happier times when Robert had been alive to share their agricultural enthusiasms. It was in speaking of those earlier days that Edmund's carefully maintained composure had begun to show signs of strain. He spoke of Robert with the affection that had marked their friendship, yet she detected something new in his voice when he mentioned the late Duke's good fortune in having secured such a bride. The words themselves were conventional enough, yet the tone in which they were delivered suggested depths of feeling that made Arabella's pulse quicken in ways she knew were dangerous. She found herself responding with memories of her own, recollections of the early months of her marriage when she had still harbored hopes that affection might grow between herself and her husband. Those hopes had been disappointed, of course, as Robert's interests had lain elsewhere, but she had learned to find contentment in the companionship that had developed between them and in the friendship that had grown to include Edmund as well. It was in speaking of this companionship that she made the mistake of allowing her guard to drop sufficiently to reveal something of her present uncertainties. She mentioned, with what she intended as casual observation, the peculiar nature of Prince Henrik's courtship, the sense she had that she was being evaluated rather than appreciated, the hollowness she felt despite the honor of his attention. Edmund's response to these confidences had been immediate and intense, though he struggled visibly to maintain the proper boundaries that their respective positions demanded. He spoke with unusual passion of her worth as a woman rather than merely as a duchess, of the blindness that would fail to appreciate her intelligence and strength, of the folly of any man who would see her as a prize to be won rather than a person to be cherished. The moment stretched between them with a tension that was almost palpable, filled with the weight of words unspoken and feelings acknowledged yet impossible to pursue. Arabella found herself looking into gray eyes that held depths she had never dared to explore, seeing there a reflection of longings she had not admitted even to herself. The knowledge that he cared for her, had perhaps always cared for her, struck her with a force that left her momentarily breathless. Yet even as her heart leaped at this recognition, her mind insisted upon the impossibility of such feelings. Edmund had been Robert's dearest friend, and she was Robert's widow, bound by loyalty and propriety to maintain the dignity of her late husband's memory. Moreover, her position remained precarious despite the improvements she had managed to implement, and any hint of impropriety could destroy not merely her own reputation, but the welfare of all who depended upon the Ashworth estates. The spell was broken by the arrival of her butler, announcing another caller whose presence immediately restored them to the proper boundaries that governed their interaction. Edmund rose to take his leave with the controlled grace that marked all his movements, yet not before she had seen something that might have been pain flash across his features. The days that followed this encounter brought with them a careful restoration of the formal courtesy that had previously governed their meetings, though both were aware that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Edmund's subsequent visits maintained perfect propriety, yet Arabella found herself hypersensitive to every glance, every casual touch, every moment of shared understanding that passed between them. Meanwhile, Prince Henrik's courtship continued with unabated persistence, though Arabella began to detect signs of impatience beneath his diplomatic courtesy. His visits became slightly more frequent, his gifts more lavish, his conversation more pointed regarding the advantages that might accrue to a lady who allied herself with the Danish court. He spoke of Copenhagen's cultural sophistication, of the international connections such a marriage would provide, of the influence she might wield as a member of European royalty. These conversations invariably left Arabella feeling rather like a commodity being evaluated for purchase, though she recognized that such feelings might be unfair to a gentleman who was, by all appearances, offering her a crown. The prince's manner toward her remained impeccably courteous, yet she could not shake the impression that she was being assessed according to criteria that had little to do with her individual worth and everything to do with her usefulness in advancing Denmark's diplomatic interests. It was during this period of increasing pressure from the prince's courtship that fate arranged another encounter that would further complicate Arabella's already tumultuous emotional state. She had been walking in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, accompanied by her maid and taking the air that her physician recommended for her health, when she encountered Edmund driving his curricle along the carriageway. The meeting appeared accidental, yet something in Edmund's manner suggested that he had been hoping for just such an encounter. He had stopped to pay his respects, offering to drive her a short distance if she cared for the experience, and she had accepted with a casualness that belied the rapid beating of her heart. The drive that followed had provided them with a privacy that their usual formal meetings could not afford, and their conversation had quickly turned to subjects that would have been impossible to discuss in her morning room. Edmund spoke with unusual directness about his concerns for her welfare, his reservations regarding the prince's intentions, his fear that she might be rushing toward a decision that would bring her neither happiness nor security. She found herself responding with equal honesty, admitting to doubts she had shared with no one else, confessing to the hollowness she felt when contemplating a future that should have represented the pinnacle of achievement for any English lady. In the intimacy created by their shared solitude, surrounded by the spring beauty of the park, she allowed herself to acknowledge feelings that her reason insisted were impossible. Yet even as her heart rejoiced in this moment of connection, her mind insisted upon the practical realities that governed her situation. She was a widow, whose financial security remained uncertain despite her careful management, responsible for the welfare of hundreds of dependents whose livelihoods depended upon her decisions. Prince Henrik offered not merely marriage, but salvation for the Ashworth estates, a guarantee that all who depended upon her would be provided for regardless of her personal feelings. Edmund, as though reading her thoughts, had spoken with passionate intensity about alternatives that might exist, about possibilities for securing her financial independence that would not require the sacrifice of her personal happiness. Yet even as he spoke, they both understood the limitations that circumscribed their options, the narrow range of choices available to a widow in her position, regardless of the depth of feeling that might exist between them. The drive concluded with both participants acutely aware that they had ventured onto dangerous ground, had acknowledged feelings that proper society would condemn as inappropriate, regardless of their sincerity. They parted with careful courtesy, yet Arabella carried with her the memory of emotions laid bare, of possibilities glimpsed that seemed as impossible as they were desirable. Such was the cruel irony of her position that the very security she sought for herself and her dependents might require her to sacrifice the only relationship that had ever offered her genuine emotional fulfillment. As she returned to her duties that afternoon, reviewing correspondence from her solicitors and meeting with her steward regarding estate matters, she found herself torn between duty and desire in ways that seemed to offer no resolution. Fortune, it seemed, had other plans than those which careful propriety might dictate, for the following week brought with it an invitation that would prove instrumental in forcing Arabella to confront the true nature of her feelings. Lady Pemberton, one of society's most accomplished hostesses, had arranged a house party at her Hertfordshire estate, a gathering designed to showcase the season's most eligible matches whilst providing opportunities for more intimate acquaintance than London's formal entertainments typically allowed. The guest list, as Arabella discovered upon receiving her invitation, had been composed with the mathematical precision that marked Lady Pemberton's approach to social engineering. Prince Henrik would naturally be present, as would several of the season's most promising debutantes and their carefully selected escorts. Edmund's name appeared among the invited guests, a circumstance that caused Arabella's pulse to quicken despite her efforts to maintain proper indifference. She accepted the invitation with the gracious acknowledgement that social obligation demanded, though privately she dreaded the prospect of several days spent navigating the delicate balance between Prince Henrik's increasingly pointed attentions and her own growing awareness of Edmund's presence. The house party format would provide fewer opportunities for escape than London society typically offered, requiring her to maintain perfect composure under circumstances that promised to test her emotional equilibrium severely. The journey to Pemberton Hall required the better part of a day's travel, allowing Arabella time to prepare herself mentally for the ordeal ahead. She traveled in company with several other guests, including Lady Margaret, whose conversation provided a steady stream of gossip regarding the romantic possibilities that such gatherings traditionally afforded. Margaret spoke with particular enthusiasm about the likelihood that the prince might use the intimate setting to advance his suit, a prospect that filled Arabella with equal measures of anticipation and dread. Pemberton Hall proved to be everything that its reputation suggested. A magnificent Jacobean mansion set within grounds that showcased English landscape gardening at its finest. The house itself rose from perfectly manicured lawns with the confident grandeur that marked the greatest achievements of English architecture, whilst the interior displayed centuries of accumulated treasures in settings designed to impress even the most sophisticated visitors. Arabella had been assigned apartments befitting her rank, elegant rooms that overlooked the estate's famous rose gardens and provided views across parkland that stretched to distant hills. The luxury of her accommodations spoke to Lady Pemberton's understanding of the political significance that a successful match between the Danish prince and an English duchess would represent, though Arabella found herself wishing for less conspicuous quarters that might have afforded greater privacy. The first evening's entertainment followed the pattern established by generations of such gatherings, beginning with a formal dinner that showcased both the host's culinary resources and the conversational brilliance of the assembled guests. Prince Henrik had been seated at Arabella's right hand, a placement that ensured their conversation would be observed and analyzed by every person present, whilst Edmund occupied a position several places distant that nevertheless allowed him to observe their interaction with the careful attention she had learned to expect. The prince's behavior throughout the dinner maintained its characteristic blend of charm and calculation, his conversation touching upon subjects designed to display both his sophistication and his particular interest in English culture. He spoke with apparent enthusiasm about the beauty of the English countryside, the superiority of English horsemanship, the elegance of English ladies' dress and manner. Yet beneath these compliments, Arabella detected the same evaluative quality that had characterized all his previous approaches to her. When the ladies withdrew to leave the gentlemen to their port, Arabella found herself surrounded by companions eager to discuss the romantic possibilities that the house party setting traditionally encouraged. Lady Pemberton herself made no attempt to conceal her satisfaction at having orchestrated such a promising encounter, whilst the younger ladies present spoke with breathless enthusiasm about the romance of being courted by an actual prince. Yet Arabella felt oddly disconnected from these conversations, as though she were observing the excitement from some distant vantage point rather than participating as its primary focus. She responded to questions with appropriate gracious acknowledgement, yet her thoughts remained divided between the prince's obvious intentions and her awareness of Edmund's presence elsewhere in the house. The evening's entertainment progressed with musical performances by several of the ladies, followed by card games arranged according to strict protocols that ensured proper mixing of the assembled company. Prince Henrik claimed the honor of partnering Arabella at whist, a circumstance that provided opportunities for private conversation whilst maintaining perfect propriety under the watchful eyes of their fellow guests. Their play proceeded smoothly, for both were accomplished card players trained from childhood in the social skills that such games demanded. Yet their conversation during the intervals between hands carried an undercurrent of significance that had little to do with their cards. The prince spoke with increasing directness about his impressions of English society, his appreciation for the warmth of his reception, his hopes that his visit might establish lasting connections between himself and his hosts. When the evening's entertainment concluded, and the guests began to disperse toward their respective apartments, Prince Henrik requested the honor of escorting Arabella to her chambers, a courtesy that she could hardly refuse despite her growing desire for solitude. Their progress through the corridors proceeded with the measured pace that proper decorum demanded, yet she found herself intensely conscious of his presence beside her, of the weight of expectation that seemed to accompany their every interaction. At the door to her apartments, the prince paused with the air of one who had reached a decision of considerable import. He spoke with unusual earnestness about the pleasure her company had afforded him, the hope that she might look favorably upon his continued attentions, the possibility that their acquaintance might develop into something of more lasting significance. His words were chosen with diplomatic precision, yet their meaning was unmistakably clear. Arabella responded with the gracious acknowledgement that breeding demanded, though she found herself unable to provide the encouragement that his words seemed to invite. She spoke of the honor his attention represented, the gratitude she felt for his kindness, the pleasure their conversations had afforded her. Yet even as she uttered these conventional responses, she was aware of their inadequacy, of the growing chasm between what duty seemed to demand and what her heart desired. The prince accepted her response with the courteous patience that marked all his actions, though she detected a flicker of something that might have been disappointment in his blue eyes. He withdrew with perfect grace, leaving her alone with thoughts that seemed to offer no resolution to the conflicts that plagued her. Sleep proved elusive that night, as her mind wrestled with the implications of the prince's increasingly obvious intentions. She found herself pacing the elegant confines of her chamber, her silk wrapper rustling softly as she moved between the windows that overlooked the moonlit gardens. The beauty of the night seemed to mock her inner turmoil, offering serenity that her troubled thoughts could not embrace. It was during these restless hours that fate arranged the encounter which would alter everything. Unable to bear the confines of her chamber any longer, Arabella had wrapped herself in a cloak and ventured onto the small balcony that adjoined her apartments, seeking solace in the cool night air and the distant murmur of the fountain that graced Lady Pemberton's rose garden. She had not expected to discover that she was not alone in her inability to find rest. A figure moved among the garden paths below, and even in the uncertain moonlight, she recognized the familiar silhouette of Edmund, apparently as sleepless as herself. For a moment, she considered withdrawing, retreating to the safety of her chamber before her presence could be discovered. Yet something in his solitary figure struck her with unexpected poignancy. Perhaps it was the memory of their recent conversation in Hyde Park, or perhaps the growing weight of decisions that seemed to offer no satisfactory resolution. But she found herself calling softly to him from her balcony. The sound of her voice in the still night air caused him to look up, and even at that distance she could see the surprise that crossed his features before being replaced by something that might have been joy. The proprieties that governed their usual interactions seemed somehow suspended in the magical atmosphere of the moonlit garden. When Edmund suggested that she might join him for a walk along the garden paths, using the external staircase that provided access to the terrace below, she found herself accepting with a spontaneity that daylight would never have permitted. In the night garden, moonlight silvered rose petals until they gleamed like scattered silk veils, whilst shadows pooled beneath ancient oaks in whispered invitation. The air itself seemed weighted with jasmine and secrets, each breath carrying promises that daylight would never dare to make. They walked in companionable silence at first, both conscious of the impropriety of their meeting, yet reluctant to break the spell that the night had cast over them. When conversation began, it emerged naturally from the shared beauty of their surroundings, touching upon the artistry of the garden's design, the perfection of the evening's weather, the particular magic that moonlight lent to even familiar landscapes. Yet gradually, inevitably, their talk turned to more personal matters, to the pressures that had driven both of them to seek solace in solitary wandering. Edmund spoke with unusual openness about the constraints that his position imposed, the loneliness that accompanied great wealth when it came without the blessing of genuine companionship, the frustration of watching her struggle with decisions that seemed to offer no satisfactory resolution. Arabella found herself responding with equal honesty, admitting to fears she had shared with no one else, confessing to the growing sense that she was trapped between duties that demanded sacrifice of her personal happiness. She spoke of the prince's courtship with a frankness that would have been impossible in more formal circumstances, acknowledging both the honor it represented and the hollowness it inspired within her heart. It was then, in a moment of absolute honesty that seemed permitted only by the magical privacy of the moonlit garden, that Edmund spoke the words that would change everything between them. He confessed, with a passion that years of careful control had barely contained, that he had loved her from almost the first moment of their acquaintance, that his friendship with Robert had been both blessing and curse in preventing him from ever speaking of feelings that had only grown stronger through years of enforced silence. The revelation struck Arabella with a force that left her momentarily speechless, though her heart leaped with a joy that she could no longer deny. She had sensed something of his feelings in recent weeks, had caught glimpses of emotions held carefully in check, yet hearing the words spoken aloud transformed speculation into certainty that both thrilled and terrified her. Her response, when it came, carried all the pent-up longing that she had struggled to suppress throughout the months of their careful friendship. She admitted that her feelings toward him had evolved far beyond mere appreciation for his steady support, that his presence had become essential to her peace of mind in ways that seemed both wonderful and impossible. The words seemed to pour from her heart without conscious thought, years of restrained emotion finally finding voice in the magical privacy of the night garden. The moment that followed might have belonged to a fairy tale rather than the carefully ordered world of Regency society. They stood facing each other on the moonlit path, the fountain's gentle music providing accompaniment to confessions that changed everything between them. When Edmund stepped closer, raising his hand to touch her face with infinite gentleness, Arabella felt as though her heart might burst with the joy of finally acknowledging feelings that had grown in secret for so long. Yet even as she savored the sweetness of that moment, reality intruded with reminders of the obstacles that stood between them and any hope of happiness. She was still Robert's widow, still bound by the proprieties that govern such relationships, still responsible for the welfare of the Ashworth estates and all who depended upon them. Edmund was still Robert's dearest friend, still constrained by loyalty and honor from actions that might be seen as betraying that friendship, still limited by the same social conventions that constrained her own choices. The kiss they shared beneath the moonlight was both culmination and beginning, a moment of perfect connection that acknowledged feelings too long denied whilst simultaneously recognizing the impossibility of their situation. It lasted only seconds, yet it contained within it all the yearning and desperation of hearts that had found their match at last, only to discover that circumstances might forever prevent their union. When they finally drew apart, both were trembling with the force of emotions too long suppressed. They stood in silence for long moments, each acutely aware that they had crossed a boundary from which there could be no retreat, that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by acknowledgments that could never be taken back. The practical difficulties of their situation seemed to loom larger in the aftermath of such perfect emotional connection. Arabella spoke with painful honesty about the financial pressures that constrained her choices, the responsibilities that weighed upon her decisions, the stark reality that Prince Henrik's suit offered security not merely for herself, but for all who depended upon the Ashworth name. Edmund's response revealed the depth of his understanding of her predicament, even as it demonstrated his own willingness to sacrifice everything for her happiness. He spoke of investments that might be arranged to secure her independence, of support he could provide without seeking anything in return, of alternatives that might exist if she could find the courage to reject what society would consider an advantageous match. Yet even as they explored these possibilities, both understood the constraints that limited their options. Any open relationship between them would be seen as scandalous, given her recent widowhood and his friendship with her late husband. The prince's suit represented more than personal opportunity. It carried implications for England's diplomatic relationship with Denmark that made rejection a matter of political as well as personal consequence. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reluctantly acknowledged the need to return to their respective chambers before their absence could be discovered and misconstrued. They parted with promises to find ways to continue their conversations, to explore possibilities that might exist despite the obstacles that seemed to surround them. Yet both were aware that the night had created as many problems as it had resolved. Arabella returned to her chamber with heart and mind in equal turmoil, knowing that she could never again pretend indifference to Edmund, while simultaneously recognizing that their newfound understanding might make her situation infinitely more difficult to resolve. The joy of finally acknowledging their mutual feelings warred with despair at the impossibility of acting upon those feelings within the constraints of their society. The morning following their moonlit confession brought with it all the awkwardness that daylight inevitably cast upon actions taken in darkness. Arabella descended to breakfast with carefully maintained composure, though she found herself hyper-conscious of Edmund's presence at the opposite end of the table, of the necessity of maintaining perfect propriety under the watchful eyes of their fellow guests. Prince Henrik appeared particularly solicitous of her welfare, inquiring with courteous concern about her rest, and expressing hopes that the day's planned activities would prove agreeable to her. His attentiveness carried an undertone of something more serious than mere courtesy, and Arabella sensed that their conversation of the previous evening had moved their relationship to a new level of understanding that would soon require more definitive responses from her. The day's entertainment had been designed by Lady Pemberton with her characteristic attention to romantic possibility. The party would divide into smaller groups for various pursuits: riding for those who favored equestrian activities, a visit to the nearby ruins for those interested in picturesque scenery, and a more sedate exploration of the estate's famous gardens for those who preferred gentler exercise. Arabella found herself claimed by Prince Henrik for the garden tour, whilst Edmund had been recruited for the riding party that would explore the estate's more distant boundaries. The separation felt both relief and torment, sparing her the difficulty of maintaining indifference whilst depriving her of his steadying presence at a time when she felt increasingly uncertain of her ability to navigate the prince's growing expectations. The garden tour proceeded with all the ceremony that such occasions demanded, led by Lady Pemberton herself with commentary designed to showcase both the estate's horticultural achievements and the romantic possibilities that such settings traditionally encouraged. Prince Henrik proved an attentive companion, his conversation revealing genuine appreciation for the artistry of English garden design, whilst providing numerous opportunities for more personal exchanges. It was during their exploration of the estate's famous maze that the prince chose to advance his suit with the directness that his royal position permitted. They had become temporarily separated from their companions, finding themselves alone among the high hedge walls that created intimate privacy within the larger group setting. The moment seemed designed by Providence for declarations of the most significant kind. Prince Henrik spoke with the eloquence that his diplomatic training had perfected, yet beneath the polished phrases lay unmistakable sincerity. He spoke of his growing appreciation for her qualities, his admiration for her intelligence and strength, his conviction that she possessed all the attributes that would make her an ideal partner for a man in his position. The proposal, when it came, was couched in terms that acknowledged both the honor he was offering and the political advantages that such a union would provide. Arabella listened with the attention that courtesy demanded, yet her heart felt strangely distant from words that should have filled her with triumph. The prince offered everything that rational calculation suggested she should desire: security, position, influence, and escape from the financial pressures that constrained her current existence. Yet as she looked into his earnest blue eyes, she found herself thinking not of crowns and courts, but of gray eyes that held depths she longed to explore. Her response, when it came, reflected both gratitude for the honor he offered and reluctance to commit herself without proper consideration. She spoke of the magnitude of the decision he was asking her to make, the need for time to contemplate all the implications such a match would entail, the respect she owed to her late husband's memory in making choices that would affect her future. The prince accepted her request for time with the gracious patience that marked all his dealings with her, though she detected signs of frustration beneath his diplomatic composure. He spoke of his understanding of her position, his willingness to allow her whatever time she required, his hope that reflection would lead her to view his suit favorably. Yet his manner suggested that he expected such reflection to confirm what logic insisted was the only sensible choice available to her. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other members of their party, who had successfully navigated the maze's complexities to reach the central pavilion where refreshments had been arranged. The return to company provided welcome relief from the intensity of the prince's proposal. Yet Arabella found herself acutely conscious of the weight of decision that now pressed upon her. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of social obligations that required constant performance despite her inner turmoil. She moved through the required interactions with practiced grace, participating in conversations about art and literature, expressing appropriate admiration for the estate's beauties, maintaining the pleasant demeanor that her position demanded. Yet beneath this surface calm, her mind wrestled with implications that seemed to offer no satisfactory resolution. It was late in the afternoon when fate arranged the misunderstanding that would threaten to destroy everything she had discovered about her own heart. She had been walking alone in the rose garden, seeking momentary solitude to organize her thoughts, when she overheard a conversation that struck her like a physical blow. Two gentlemen stood talking on the terrace above, their voices carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. She recognized one voice as belonging to Lord Hartwell, the same gentleman whose calculating gaze she had noticed at the embassy soirée, a notorious collector of society's indiscretions, whose conversation typically centered on the financial affairs and romantic entanglements of his social circle. The other speaker remained unidentified, though his accent suggested continental origins. The subject of their discussion proved to be herself and the various gentlemen whose names had been connected with hers in society's endless speculation. Lord Hartwell spoke with malicious pleasure about the precarious state of the Ashworth finances, information that should have been known only to her most trusted advisors. He detailed with disturbing accuracy the extent of her late husband's debts, the measures she had taken to address them, and the continuing vulnerability of her position despite her careful management. Yet it was his companion's response that struck her with devastating force. The unknown gentleman spoke with casual cruelty about the desperation that financial insecurity could inspire in even the most well-bred ladies, the willingness of widows in difficult circumstances to accept attentions from any gentleman who might offer security. He mentioned specifically her relationship with Edmund, suggesting with crude directness that her encouragement of his interest stemmed from calculation rather than genuine feeling. The words hit Arabella with the force of a physical assault, not because she believed their truth, but because they articulated fears she had tried to suppress about her own motivations. Could her growing feelings for Edmund be influenced by gratitude for his support during her difficulties? Might her rejection of conventional wisdom in favor of following her heart be nothing more than sophisticated self-deception designed to justify choices based on practical necessity rather than genuine emotion? Worse still was the implication that others might view her behavior in such terms, that her reputation for dignity and proper conduct might be compromised by speculation about her financial circumstances and their influence on her romantic decisions. The thought that Edmund might become the subject of such gossip, that his honor might be questioned because of his association with her, filled her with horror that made rational thought almost impossible. She fled the garden in a state of distress that she struggled to conceal from the other guests, retiring to her chamber with the excuse of a sudden headache that was not entirely fabricated. The evening's entertainments proceeded without her participation, though she could hear music and laughter from the drawing rooms below as she paced her chamber in an agony of indecision. The cruel irony of her situation seemed almost designed to test the limits of human endurance. The very financial pressures that made Prince Henrik's suit so attractive might also be seen as casting doubt upon the sincerity of any feelings she might express toward Edmund. Society would inevitably speculate about her motives, would question whether love or calculation guided her choices, would spread gossip that could destroy both their reputations regardless of the truth of their feelings. Sleep once again proved impossible, though this time her restlessness stemmed not from joy at discovered love, but from anguish at its apparent impossibility. The conversation she had overheard played repeatedly in her mind, its cruel implications growing more devastating with each repetition. By morning, she had convinced herself that honor demanded she protect Edmund from the scandal that association with her might bring, even if such protection required her to sacrifice her own happiness. The decision, once made, filled her with a curious mixture of despair and relief. If she could not have the man she loved without compromising his honor and reputation, then duty clearly demanded that she choose the path that would spare him such consequences. Prince Henrik's suit offered not merely personal security, but escape from circumstances that made her love appear tainted by necessity rather than blessed by choice. When morning came, bringing with it the final day of the house party, Arabella had made her decision with the finality that desperation sometimes provides. She would accept Prince Henrik's proposal, not because her heart desired such a union, but because honor demanded she protect the man she truly loved from the consequences of her own precarious position. The final morning of the house party dawned with deceptive serenity, the perfect English weather seeming to mock the turmoil that raged within Arabella's breast as she prepared to sacrifice everything her heart desired for the sake of protecting Edmund's honor. She had requested a private audience with Prince Henrik, sending word through the proper channels that she was prepared to give him the answer to his proposal. The prince received her message with obvious satisfaction, arranging to meet her in Lady Pemberton's private study, a setting that would afford them the privacy such a momentous conversation required whilst maintaining perfect propriety. As Arabella prepared for what she believed would be the most difficult conversation of her life, she struggled to compose herself for the performance that duty seemed to demand. Yet fate, it seemed, had prepared revelations that would alter everything she believed about her situation. As she made her way toward the appointed meeting, she encountered Edmund in the corridor, his expression grave with a determination that matched her own. Before she could speak, he requested a word with her on a matter of urgent importance, his manner suggesting that delay might prove catastrophic. They stepped into an empty morning room where Edmund's first words shattered the foundation of the decision she had spent the night constructing. He had learned, through means he did not specify, but which his expression suggested were entirely honorable, of the conversation she had overheard in the garden. More importantly, he had discovered the identity of Lord Hartwell's companion and the true source of the malicious gossip that had caused her such anguish. The continental gentleman proved to be an agent of the French court, whose interest in her affairs stemmed not from idle curiosity, but from a deliberate campaign to discredit her reputation and prevent her marriage to Prince Henrik. The French government, it appeared, viewed the potential alliance between Denmark and England with considerable alarm, seeing in such a union the possibility of diplomatic arrangements that might threaten French interests. Edmund's investigation had revealed the systematic nature of the attack upon her reputation, the careful dissemination of information designed to make her appear desperate and calculating rather than worthy of serious consideration by a foreign prince. The financial details that Lord Hartwell had discussed with such apparent authority had been deliberately leaked by agents whose purpose was to destroy her credibility as a potential bride for Prince Henrik. The revelation struck Arabella with a force that left her momentarily speechless. The conversation that had caused her such anguish, the fears that had driven her to sacrifice her own happiness for Edmund's protection, the decision that had seemed so inevitable just moments before, all of it had been based upon deliberate manipulation designed to achieve exactly the result she had been prepared to provide. Yet even as relief flooded through her at learning that the gossip held no truth, a new and more terrible realization began to take shape. If foreign agents were willing to go to such lengths to prevent her marriage to Prince Henrik, then the political implications of such a union were far more significant than she had understood. Her personal decision carried consequences that extended far beyond her own happiness or even Edmund's reputation. Edmund, reading her thoughts with the understanding that came from years of friendship, spoke with passionate intensity about the futility of sacrificing personal happiness to serve the machinations of foreign governments whose interests bore no relationship to her own welfare. He argued that she owed nothing to diplomatic games that treated her as a pawn rather than a person, that her first duty was to her own heart rather than to political considerations she had never chosen to embrace. His words carried all the conviction of a man who had found love after years of loneliness and who refused to surrender it to forces beyond their control. He spoke of alternatives that might exist if she possessed the courage to reject conventional wisdom, of possibilities that could secure her independence without requiring sacrifice of her personal happiness. Yet even as he painted pictures of a future they might share, both understood the magnitude of the forces arrayed against such dreams. It was then that the most devastating revelation of all emerged from their desperate conversation. Edmund confessed that his investigation had uncovered not merely the source of the gossip, but evidence of more serious threats to her welfare. The French agents who had been spreading rumors about her reputation had also been investigating her financial affairs with an attention that suggested more sinister purposes than mere character assassination. The Ashworth estates, it appeared, held strategic value beyond their obvious agricultural worth. Certain properties commanded positions that would be valuable for military purposes should hostilities resume between England and France, whilst others controlled transportation routes that might prove significant in times of conflict. The systematic pressure that had been applied to her finances might have been designed not merely to force her into an unwanted marriage, but to gain foreign influence over English resources. The implications of this discovery struck both of them with horrifying clarity. Arabella's acceptance of Prince Henrik's proposal might indeed serve French interests by preventing a Danish alliance, but rejection might expose her to pressures of an entirely different and more dangerous nature. She found herself caught between political forces whose games treated human happiness as expendable in pursuit of national advantage. Yet it was in confronting this seemingly impossible situation that Arabella discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. The knowledge that her private struggles had been orchestrated by enemies of England filled her with an indignation that burned away the uncertainty and fear that had plagued her for weeks. She would not allow her life to be shaped by those who viewed her as a tool to be manipulated rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration. Edmund's response to her newfound determination revealed the depth of his commitment to her welfare above all other considerations. He spoke with quiet conviction about his willingness to face whatever consequences might result from defying those who sought to control their destiny, about the resources at his disposal for protecting both her independence and her safety, about the network of loyal friends who would support them against any threats that might emerge. The conversation that followed might have belonged to a novel of political intrigue rather than a drawing room romance, yet it laid the foundation for decisions that would determine their entire future. They discussed strategies for exposing the foreign manipulation of her affairs, methods for securing her financial independence that would remove her from political calculations, and plans for protecting themselves against retribution from forces whose games they had chosen to reject. By the time their conference concluded, both had committed themselves to a course of action that would require tremendous courage, but offered the possibility of genuine happiness earned through struggle rather than bestowed by political convenience. Arabella would reject Prince Henrik's proposal, not to sacrifice her happiness, but to claim it on terms that honored both her integrity and her heart. The meeting with Prince Henrik that followed proved to be unlike anything Arabella had anticipated. She entered Lady Pemberton's study, prepared for disappointment and possibly anger from a man whose suit she was about to decline. Yet she found instead a gentleman whose own investigations had revealed truths that changed everything about their relationship. Prince Henrik received her with the courtesy that had marked all their interactions, yet his manner carried a gravity that suggested he too had discoveries to share. Before she could speak, he presented her with information that demonstrated his own awareness of the political machinations that had surrounded their courtship, his understanding of the foreign interference that had sought to manipulate both their decisions. The prince's revelation proved even more startling than Edmund's discoveries. His suit, whilst genuine in its appreciation of her personal qualities, had indeed been motivated in part by diplomatic considerations that his government viewed as essential to Denmark's security. Yet his investigation into the obstacles that had appeared to threaten their potential union had revealed the extent of foreign manipulation that offended his sense of honor as much as it had threatened her reputation. Most surprising of all was his acknowledgement that he had observed her attachment to Edmund with the understanding that comes from experience of genuine feeling. Prince Henrik confessed that his own heart remained engaged elsewhere, with a lady of his own court whose position made their union impossible under current political circumstances, yet whose hold upon his affections made marriage to another a matter of duty rather than inclination. The conversation that followed transformed what should have been a painful rejection into something approaching a diplomatic negotiation between allies rather than disappointed lovers. Both acknowledged the political pressures that had shaped their courtship. Both recognized the manipulation that had sought to force decisions serving interests other than their own. And both committed themselves to finding solutions that would serve their respective needs without sacrificing their personal integrity. Prince Henrik's proposal proved as surprising as everything else about their final interview. Rather than seeking to marry her for political advantage, he proposed a different kind of alliance that would serve both their purposes whilst allowing them freedom to pursue happiness on their own terms. The details of such an arrangement would require careful negotiation with both governments. Yet the possibility offered hope that political necessity need not triumph over personal choice. The days that followed Arabella's return to London brought with them a flurry of activity that would have challenged the most experienced diplomat, as the careful plans laid at Pemberton Hall began to take shape with all the precision that Edmund's methodical mind could devise. The network of loyal friends and allies that he had mentioned proved both more extensive and more influential than Arabella had dared hope. Yet their initial efforts met with frustrating resistance from officials who viewed their claims with skepticism bordering on dismissal. The first weeks of their campaign seemed destined for failure as doors closed in faces and letters went unanswered. The conspiracy they sought to expose had been carefully constructed to appear as nothing more than society gossip and coincidental misfortune, whilst those involved possessed both the resources and connections to deflect serious investigation. More than once, Arabella found herself wondering if they had undertaken an impossible task, if the forces arrayed against them were simply too powerful to challenge. It was Edmund's stubborn persistence, combined with evidence that proved too compelling to ignore, that finally began to turn the tide. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a junior clerk in the Treasury who, having heard whispers of Edmund's unshakable reputation for honor, risked his position to reveal the suspicious financial transactions he had witnessed. This single act of courage, inspired by trust in Edmund's character, opened channels of investigation that had previously remained closed to them. The first phase of their campaign involved the careful exposure of the foreign manipulation that had targeted Arabella's reputation and finances. Edmund's investigation had uncovered a web of intrigue that reached far beyond her personal situation, revealing systematic attempts to influence English society and politics through the corruption of prominent figures. The evidence, when presented to the proper authorities, created a sensation that dominated London's drawing rooms for weeks. Lord Hartwell, whose loose tongue had unwittingly revealed the conspiracy against her, found himself the subject of official investigation that quickly revealed the true extent of his involvement with foreign agents. His social disgrace was swift and complete, serving as both justice for his malicious gossip and warning to others who might be tempted to serve interests hostile to England's welfare. More importantly, for Arabella's immediate concerns, the revelation of foreign interference in her affairs served to discredit the rumors that had been spread about her financial desperation and romantic calculations. Society's reaction to the discovery that she had been the target of enemy agents transformed her from an object of gossip into something approaching a heroine, a lady whose dignity had been assailed by England's enemies precisely because they recognized her worth. Prince Henrik proved as good as his word in supporting their efforts, providing evidence from his own government's intelligence services that confirmed the French involvement in the conspiracy against their potential alliance. His cooperation in exposing the manipulation that had targeted both of them earned him respect throughout London society, while simultaneously serving Danish interests by demonstrating their nation's commitment to honest dealing with England. The diplomatic ramifications of these revelations created opportunities that neither Arabella nor Edmund had dared anticipate. The British government, embarrassed by the extent of foreign infiltration into London society, proved remarkably receptive to arrangements that would demonstrate their commitment to protecting English citizens from such interference whilst maintaining valuable diplomatic relationships. The solution that emerged from these complex negotiations satisfied everyone's essential interests whilst allowing genuine feeling to triumph over political calculation. Prince Henrik received authorization to pursue the diplomatic alliance his government desired through means that did not require personal sacrifice, whilst Arabella gained protection from foreign threats without surrendering her freedom to choose her own future. The financial independence that had seemed so elusive proved surprisingly achievable once the artificial pressures created by enemy manipulation were removed. Edmund's resources, combined with the compensation that the government provided for the harassment she had endured, secured the Ashworth estates against any future threats, whilst ensuring that her dependents would continue to prosper under her stewardship. Yet it was the personal resolution of their situation that brought the greatest joy to all involved. Society, having learned of the trials she had endured and the dignity with which she had faced them, received news of her engagement to Edmund with approbation rather than scandal. Their marriage was seen not as an improper haste on the part of a desperate widow, but as the natural outcome of a friendship tested by adversity and found strong enough to withstand any trial. The wedding itself, celebrated in the parish church that had served the Ashworth family for generations, brought together all the various threads of their story in a ceremony that satisfied both personal sentiment and social expectation. Prince Henrik attended as an honored guest, his presence serving to demonstrate the diplomatic success that had emerged from their personal happiness, whilst the assembled company included representatives of all the various interests that had found satisfaction in the resolution of their affairs. Edmund's vows were spoken with the quiet intensity that marked all his important communications, his promises carrying the weight of years of friendship, transformed into something far deeper and more enduring. Arabella's responses reflected the journey she had traveled from duty-bound widow to a woman who had claimed the right to choose her own happiness, her words carrying both gratitude for the past and joy in the future they would build together. The celebration that followed their wedding ceremony reflected the broader happiness that their union had created. The various political concerns that had once threatened to separate them had been resolved in ways that served everyone's interests, whilst their personal happiness had been achieved through means that enhanced, rather than compromised, their honor and reputation. As they stood together in the drawing room of what had once been her solitary refuge, now transformed by their union into the foundation for a shared future, Arabella reflected on the curious paths that had led to such perfect resolution. The threats that had once seemed so overwhelming had been defeated through courage and determination, whilst the love that had seemed impossible had proven strong enough to overcome every obstacle placed in its path. Edmund's arms around her carried the promise of years ahead that would be marked by partnership rather than solitude, by shared joys and mutual support rather than the lonely burden of individual responsibility. The estates that had once weighed so heavily upon her shoulders would now benefit from his expertise and resources, whilst the dependents who had relied upon her care would prosper under their combined stewardship. The future stretched before them with all the promise that love supported by respect and understanding could provide. They would face whatever challenges emerged with the confidence that came from having their relationship tested by the most severe trials and proven strong enough to survive anything that fate might arrange. Prince Henrik, in taking his leave after the wedding celebration, spoke with genuine warmth about the satisfaction he felt in seeing justice triumph over manipulation, love conquer calculation, and personal happiness achieved through means that served rather than betrayed the higher principles that should guide human conduct. His own future, he hinted, might yet provide similar satisfaction as changing political circumstances created new possibilities for personal as well as diplomatic success. The various friends and allies who had supported their cause throughout the difficult weeks of struggle expressed similar satisfaction in seeing virtue rewarded and villainy defeated. Their network of support, forged in crisis, would endure to provide strength and counsel through whatever future challenges might arise, creating bonds of loyalty that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. As the last guests departed and Arabella and Edmund found themselves alone in the house that would now shelter their shared life, they spoke with quiet amazement about the journey that had brought them to such perfect happiness. The obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable had been overcome through patience, courage, and the unwavering support of those who recognized the value of genuine feeling over political convenience. The evening concluded with conversations that touched upon plans for their future together, improvements to be made to their combined estates, travels they hoped to undertake, the family they dreamed of establishing in the years ahead. Each topic carried the particular sweetness that comes from sharing dreams with someone whose love provides both inspiration and practical support for achieving them. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, even against the machinations of those who would sacrifice human happiness to political advantage, even when the obstacles appear too great for mere mortal determination to overcome. In the triumph of Arabella and Edmund's union, we see reflected the eternal truth that genuine feeling, supported by honor and strengthened by adversity, possesses power enough to transform the world itself in service of the heart's deepest longings.